Hello, everyone. Today we're going to be exploring Chapter 7 in our text, which deals with hospital outpatient reimbursement. Specifically, we're going to talk about the Hospital Outpatient Payment System known as OPPS. This system is critical to how hospitals get paid for outpatient services. Let's have a closer look. At the end of this video lecture, you're going to be able to define what bundling and packaging is, what status indicators or SIs are, and we'll talk about packaging and how it's used in the OPPS reimbursement system. The Medicare Hospital Outpatient System, otherwise known as Medicare OPPS, applies to services that are applied in the hospital outpatient setting, such as emergency departments, clinics, and same-day surgery. It operates on a calendar year basis, and it is updated every year. Again, when you say same-day surgery, we're only talking about same-day surgery units that are actually attached to the hospital itself. We're not talking about freestanding ambulatory surgery centers. OPPS reimbursement uses multiple methodologies. These include fee schedule payments for such things as ambulatory services, durable medical equipment. It also includes prospective payments based on the ambulatory payment classifications for most outpatient services, and some reasonable cost payments for specific items such as corneal tissue acquisition and some vaccines. Ambulatory patient classifications, or APCs, are basically a classification system. It's a grouping that groups, instead of diseases, into categories for reimbursement purposes. It groups procedures with like resource consumption together. These are grouped based on the procedure as opposed to the principal diagnosis. The diagnosis does not play a role in the grouping of an APC. The term packaging is talking about a single payment for several combined procedures. And they give some examples of this in 7.1 in your text. Bundling is kind of a similar concept. We're talking about bundling multiple significant procedures into a single unit of payment. And this is covered in example 7.2 in your text. With partially packaged systems, it encourages hospitals to use their resources more efficiently. It incentivizes cost-effective decisions, and hospitals are encouraged to negotiate better prices and optimize their supply use. This also helps hospitals establish protocols for cost-effective treatment while still maintaining all the necessary services are provided to the patient. It does, however, force hospitals to scrutinize provider orders to maximize the efficient use of the hospital's resources. Now we get into the topic of status indicators, or SI. These are codes that establish how a service, a procedure, or an item is paid in the OPPS system. And these include such things as things that are paid by the fee schedule, the APC, reasonable cost, and in some cases, some things are not paid. You can see this in detail in table 7.1, and I'd encourage you to give that some close attention. Interpreting SIs is the foundation of determining OPPS reimbursement. SIs are assigned to HCPCS codes. These are released each year in Addendum B of the OPPS final rule, and it's updated quarterly. There are multiple HCPCS codes that are reported on each encounter, so therefore you're going to have multiple SIs per each encounter. It's very important to closely examine all of these HCPCS and SI codes to make sure that the final reimbursement is appropriate. CMS uses logic within the outpatient code editor and Pricer to ensure proper reimbursement. And again, each HCPCS code is related to one APC. Each APC has standard components, including a relative weight that measures resource consumption, a national unadjusted payment, and a beneficiary copayment amount. APCs bundle payments for related procedures and services, ensuring comprehensive reimbursement. There are some APCs known as new technology APCs that allow new services to be integrated quickly using the SI categories S and T. Payment status indicators also will show per diem APC payments. There are certain APC payments that are calculated on a per diem basis, meaning that the reimbursement is based on a daily rate instead of per procedure. This approach helps manage predictable costs for extended outpatient treatments. Comprehensive APCs bundle all related services into a single payment. This reduces administrative complexity and helps the hospital streamline billing and payment processes. Conditional APCs provide payment when certain criteria is met. If the conditions aren't met, the payment is packaged with another service. And you can see this here, the STV package that's described in figure 7.3 in your tax, the T package, which is described in example 7.4 in your tax, and the conditionally packaged laboratory test. Notice that all these things have criteria that fall under each example. If Q1 service is on a claim with an S, T, or V service, then the Q1 service is packaged. If the Q2 service is on a claim with a T service, then the Q2 service is packaged. And then in the last example, it's packaged if it's on a claim with J1, J2, S, T, VQ1, Q2, and Q3 will be packaged. And again, this is all described in your text as well, so it's critical to take a look at those SIs. Composite APCs group multiple services into a single payment when they're performed together. This simplifies the reimbursement. Payment status indicator categories for package payments. Some services, supplies, and procedures are always packaged under OPPS and are assigned SI category N. These bundled payments, again, streamline reimbursement and reduces the billing fragmentation. These are described in Addendum B in your text, and you can also see some examples in Table 7.4 in your textbook. There are certain services such as physical therapy, ambulatory transportation that are always paid under CMS fee schedule instead of the APC system. These services follow specific reimbursement structures under the Medicare physician fee schedule and the ambulance fee schedule. Again, as we talked about, there's certain services such as corneal tissue acquisition and some pharmaceuticals that are reimbursed based on reasonable cost instead of a fixed payment. Certain services and some procedures are not reimbursed under OPPS, and these are designated with status indicator codes B, C, D, E1, E2, M, and Y. Status indicator C, for example, identifies inpatient-only procedures that are not eligible for outpatient reimbursement. With OPPS provisions, these are provisions that govern the application of the payment methodologies and the assignment of the reimbursement categories. These provisions are designed to ensure consistent and efficient payment structures across all hospital outpatient settings. You can see some examples here. Certain things are discounted when multiple procedures are performed during the same encounter. The first one's reimbursed at 100%, all others are 50%. There are modifiers applied. You can see an example here with modifier 73, surgery discontinued for a patient that's been prepped for surgery and taken to the OR before administration of the anesthesia. And again, we have some high-cost outlier services that are calculated in as well. We also have adjustments to certain hospitals, and these include such things as rural hospital adjustment, cancer hospital adjustments, and pass-throughs. With the OPPS, you have a gentleman who needs a flu and a vaccine. How is he going to be reimbursed? The charge includes both vaccines, so we have to take a look at the payment structure. Take a look at figures 7.4 and 7.5. And that's all I have for you. Please stop by office hours or send me an email if you have any questions about the hospital outpatient prospective payment system. Bye now.